This is Below the Surface, an Eclipsium podcast where we talk about supply chain and firmware security. It features guests from the cybersecurity industry and discuss the problems surrounding supply chain related issues and potential solutions. Welcome everyone to Eclipsium's Below the Surface July 2022 edition. I am Paul Asadoorian, the firmware security evangelist for Eclipsium. I'm here with Scott Scheferman, the principal strategist at Eclipsium. Scott, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. Always a pleasure.
It's good to have you on the maiden voyage, as it were, talking about this month's, it's basically a threat report, right, of what's happening in, I would say, firmware and supply chain security. Is that correct? This was something that you created.
Yeah, that's correct. It's actually been a long running threat report even before I came on Eclipsium, but I've been kind of running point on it the last year and a half or so.
Awesome. So this will cover what's happened in July of this year. And there's been a lot of interesting, I think, developments in firmware and supply chain security. Specifically, I was going to start with secure boot because you talk about that a lot in the beginning of the report. And a blog post that just went out today on Eclipsium's blog that I authored is focused around secure boot, specifically updating your revocation list, but it's a really kind of hot topic right now, especially.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a hot topic for a number of foundationally important reasons, right? I mean, it's secure boot. So if we go back in time and we remember life before secure boot, we can maybe remember those days where you would just get a rootkit or a bootkit. You could do nothing about it, and code was pretty easy to load. Deep in the operating system before the operating system booted up, you would get malicious code interject. You couldn't really do anything about it, so the industry had to just really step forward and come up with secure boot as actually part of one of the UEFI, or what I'll pronounce as UFI. How the industry heads would pronounce it, right? It's part of the UFI standard, if you will, part of the specification. And obviously, the idea is you shouldn't be able to load code that is malicious, or more importantly, not acceptable via certificate trust prior to the operating system loading, so that your operating system can do what? It can trust the hardware that it's sitting on, right? Some of
Yeah,
these
trust all
concepts are
those,
so basic.
right, all those previous layers because it validates the bootloader and the kernel depending on configuration, which is super important to be able to maintain a chain of trust in order to load your operating system, as you said, Scott.
Yeah, I think you've been working through some of those challenges in the Linux world. Is that right?
Yeah, and the answer oftentimes is like it depends. But Linux is enabled for secure boot through software called shim. So basically, the open source folks got together, created this small software package called shim that they could get validated as part of that chain of trust. And then shim contains, other mechanisms to trust parts of the boot process after shim is loaded. So shim will load the bootloader and then the kernel. So, without getting into the nitty gritty details, that's a high level how it works. And I was able to get, modern Linux distributions on pretty modern hardware, the ability to support secure boot and boot securely, which was great.
That's great. I know you're running like full-time Linux these days, right? So
I am. I do run all Linux on all of my systems, which it keeps me sharp and on my toes, basically.
yeah, for real. I know a lot of the folks in the research community have kind of shifted from their Macs over to Linux recently. Can you tell us more about why that's happening based on the processor?
Yeah, I think some of it stems from just inherent the ability inherently to control parts of your system, right? I think that's why a lot of people will shy away from other operating systems versus Linux. But the big driver that I think you're alluding to, Scott, is the introduction of Apple's M1 processor. And
Yeah.
that's an ARM-based system, and support for virtualization has not been great. And a lot of the deeply technical folks in our industry are doing things like training where they need to spin up a lot of VMs, or doing security research where they need to virtualize a lot of different operating systems. And that's just not really that feasible today on an M1 from what I understand. So a lot of those researchers, and some of them, I think, Scott, you made an introduction, right? A lot of them will reach out to me and go, "Hey, Paul, you've been running Linux for a long time. how do I make the switch over? How do I make sure I have things like secure boot? How do I do full disk encryption on Linux? So I think it's been great. I think it's still a smaller percentage of the users globally out there, certainly, but I think we're starting to see that shift, which is why it's important for me, back to secure boot, to have that supported on Linux and for folks to understand it too, because as you go down the secure boot rabbit hole, it starts to get really complex very fast. As
Yeah.
we kind of alluded to in some of the research from Eclipsium researchers, I think you and I both found some of the initial research. I believe Yuri presented, was it? And I forget. I'm mixing Intel ME and
2013.
Secure Boot. It was 2013 for Secure Boot, right? Because Secure Boot came out in around the 2012 timeframe.
Yeah, yeah. I think. Let's see when it came out. That sounds about right. The research came out in like 2013, but I feel like Secure Boot might have been out around 2008 or so.
Sure, yeah, probably
Um,
talking about it and then coming
Usually I
into
know this
more.
off the top of my head, but
Yeah,
it's just I'm blanking on it right
right.
now. But yeah,
I know Intel
yeah. So
ME was 2006 when that was first introduced. Yeah.
yeah,
So researchers have been at this for a while. Mickey and Jesse, and I say Mickey and Jesse without their last names because that's how they introduce themselves. I don't know if you noticed this, Scott, but I find it hilarious. I went back to make sure I could pronounce both of their names in full correctly. Jesse's is pretty easy, but in every presentation, I went back to I watched the first 30 seconds of 5 or 6 of their presentations. And he's like, "Hi, I'm Mickey, and this is Jesse, and we're going to talk about breaking secure boot, or we're going to talk about whatever their presentation." And every single one was like, "I'm Mickey, this is Jesse." I'm like, "Okay, that's how they want to be referred to as, so we'll refer to them as Mickey and Jesse."
yeah. I'm not even sure what the whole industry would do if they actually like just split up, so to speak, and didn't work for the same company. I should say. I mean that would be like a cataclysmic event for the whole industry.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight some of this research. Obviously, boot hole. If you Google search for that and land on the Eclipsium blog, that's a great post that describes it. And that was a vulnerability in the Grub bootloader that undermined a lot of the secure boot processes that forced us to then update our revocation list, which is also one of the primary topics I talk about in my latest blog post. So
Yeah.
I think it kind of in preparation, right, for this year's DEF CON talk, One Bootloader to Rule Them All by Mickey and Jesse, is to go back through some of that history and read some of that research.
Yeah, and in fact, the inspiration for the theme for this month's threat report was actually a conversation I had with Alex, one of our our co-founder, two co-founders, and we were just chatting back and forth, and he just like suddenly realized if you look at the last 10 years, right? Because we're going into DEF CON 30, and for folks like you and I and everybody listening, it's going to be a real sentimental kind of event. I went to last year's, I think you did too, and it was like that one felt more like DEF CON 2008 or 2002 even. It was just like super chill and you kind of knew everybody, you weren't overwhelmed. But this year they're saying up to 80,000 people could show up. I don't know if that still holds true, but we'll see what happens. But being the 30th year, it's going to be kind of a really important event for everybody. And we were just kind of rehashing the last 10 years, because a decade's a nice round number. And looking at Secure Boot, looking at all the other research that Jesse and Mickey and Alex and Yuri both have put together over the years. And what you see is this cat and mouse game where the researchers sharpen the saw of the OEMs, and in particular Microsoft, right? Because Microsoft is faced with the unfortunate position of having to run a secure operating system without easily being able to trust the hardware that's underneath it, which is built by countless OEMs, which themselves have countless upstream supply chain providers writing code. Some of it's old, 10, 15-year-old code. Some of it's brand new. Some of it has backdoor. Some of it has username and passwords embedded in it. There's all sorts of problems with software that we call firmware that shows up on this device. Then Microsoft has to land on all of those and run and be a trustable operating system. So we were just looking back at the history, thinking, every single time that Yuri or Alex or both got on stage, back 10 years ago and said something and discovered something and showed the world that something can be done or bypassed, whether it's credential guard or secure boot itself. There's so many things that they've been able to bypass that are these foundationally important security controls that Windows, out of necessity, has needed to build up over the years. So you have this cat and mouse game, and here we are, to your point, Paul, going into the 30th year anniversary, where once again, this time Jesse and Mickey will be giving a talk, one bootloader to rule them all. I mean, it pretty much says what it is. We don't want to give too much away because we can't yet, but it's let's just put it this way. It's almost poetic that this is the 30th year anniversary and yet we're giving this talk that will kind of completely take us back to square one in many respects on terms of this software operating system needing to trust the hardware conundrum that we find ourselves with.
Yeah, there's two threads I want to pull on from that, Scott. And that one is security research affecting change in the industry to make things more secure. By things, I mean, it could be the boot process, hardware, software, firmware. The research is really influencing major software providers like Microsoft to make changes to provide a more, in this case, a more secure boot process. I think that's a huge win. And you and I have been in security for a long time. It's not often we can draw those direct correlations between research coming out and products getting better. And certainly we've seen a lot of different examples of that. Microsoft has done a good job of responding to researchers over the years. We see that in their operating system. We see that leading the charge with secure boot. And those kind of initiatives are a direct result of security researchers doing what they do. And I think it's amazing because I've been covering this industry for a long time. And I love that research is affecting change. Because in a lot of areas, we see amazing research, but very little change in the industry. And that gets frustrating. So it's good to see that we're making some inroads there.
Yeah, I agree. Like, when you sit down to write a below the surface threat report and you try to ask yourself and frame, like, how should I portray this? Like, what is the real truth here? What, take off the vendor hat and you kind of step back and look at this scenario. I think what's interesting is you kind of hit on it there a little bit, but you have to ask yourself, okay, why do researchers do this at this level, at this firmware, secure boot, UEFI, Intel ME, all these low level stuff? Why are researchers doing this? And real reason is it's out of necessity. In fact, if you talk to Yuri and Alex about why they founded the company, right, and Eclipsium itself, it goes back to their recognition of, oh my gosh, based on what we see and what we know and our jobs are here inside of Intel Corporation, there's a problem, right? Not with Intel Corporation, but with like generally this problem space is really hard to solve for. And once it's compromised, like once an attacker has done the thing, right? You have a trust and a security problem that is paramount. It's the most important. It's the worst case scenario for all your security controls, perhaps impacts, etc. And so they had to step back and say, how can we give tools to the community so they can go and look at their hardware and know whether or not it's exploitable, right? I've been using the word exploitable a lot lately rather than the word vulnerable because I think we're numb to the word vulnerability management. We're numb to the world, the words like Patch Tuesday and Adobe. And when it comes to like firmware, it's a different thing when you exploit firmware, and now you have that low level access because it opens up a whole different set of scenarios that you can't as an attacker achieve when you're only at the operating system. I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes, but I wanted to really make the point. I don't know if I articulated it yet, but you don't have a lot of threats in the wild to draw from that have been observed. And the irony there, and it's so important to convey this, that the irony there's a reason why the entire security stack that we've been building the last 5 years especially can't and doesn't or won't see these kind of threats manifest. And there's a reason why companies that do experience these kind of events, financial firms, oil and gas, automobile manufacturers, you name it, that experience these events all the time related to firmware, don't have to report them, don't write a blog about them, don't need to notify privacy notification laws, or they weren't ransomed, right? It's maybe an espionage campaign that went for 4 years in their environment. If they discover that, they don't need to report that. Why would they, right? Why should they? So you have this kind of, and that's the nature of these level of threats. Like you don't find them for years. I was kind of realizing that as I wrote the threat report, that every single instance you went back the last 10 years when like a Eufy kit was discovered, in the wild. So many of them have been discovered in like the last just 2 years. And every single time you realize, wow, that was a multi-year campaign. That thing was in the wild for 2, 3, 4, 5 years before the entire security industry and the entire security stack was able to find it.
I think the ability to look where this problem is not where it needs to be in the industry. Therefore, we can say, well, there's not that many attacks on firmware. Well, did you look? We had this conversation in the context of industrial control systems. Sometimes industrial control systems will say, well, it's not evil attackers or nation states. Well, how far did you look? And I don't want to point the finger at them, right? It just could be a training thing, it could be a resource thing. How deep down the rabbit hole do you go to determine like this firmware was compromised or an attacker was hiding in the firmware? So I think we do suffer from some of that as well. I wanted to go back to secure boot for a moment too, and pulling the other thread that came to me, and that is with respects to the supply chain, because when now I just started here a little over a month ago at Eclipsium, and as I talk to our research team and others here at Eclipsium, and I ask these questions, oftentimes the answer is, well, it depends. And sometimes the question is, well, who controls that key? Like, where does that key? Well, that could be the OEM, it could be the operating system provider. Like, well, who controls the revocation list update, and how does that work? Well, that it depends on what kind of hardware you have, what vendors are involved in the supply chain of that hardware and software, and there could be multiple. Intel may play a role, HP, Dell, and Lenovo, they might play a role. The operating system, Microsoft, plays a role. So your supply chain gets not just complex, but different, depending on which type of firmware you're talking about on what type of system. And that was one of my early, realizations. I've been struggling to come up with like a finite storyline to describe that, but that's just my experience in working here. As I'm like, the answer is it depends, and they're not being coy with me. Like the answer truly is like it depends, and this I think speaks directly to your firmware supply chain and security of your supply chain.
Yeah. I've been here only a year and a half myself. And just like you've been in the industries for 25, 30 years or whatever, right? And you look back and you're like, how many times did I did red teaming, scoped a red team engagement? How many times did I did DFIR or wrote a playbook or tabletopped a threat scenario, right? Or an impact scenario? How many times have I done all the things, for Navy, for there's so many things that you think you would do in 20 years. And then you show up to a place like Eclipsium, and it's just like you're starting all over again. You're like, I cannot believe how much level of ignorance I've maintained throughout a 20-year career trying to be the best I could be, to make the most change I can make, to help customers and victims alike, right? And yet, here I show up to Eclipsium on day one, and just like you, I'm like, I cannot believe how complex this is, how unsolved for it is, and how much it's being exploited in the wild actively by those actors that we talk about all the time when it comes to malware analysis, like OS level malware, spear phishing malware, right? You talk about that all day long, and it's kind of like for lack of better words, the sexy in the industry when you can bring threat and intelligence and attribution, and you're hunting for threats, etc. But when you dive down to the firmware, all of a sudden there's this eerie kind of murky lack of understanding that we all have collectively, even language. I mean, the hardest part about working at Eclipsium is compelling people to listen that the word firmware is the most interesting, most phenomenally important, highest impact um, thing going on in the wild right now that nobody's talking about or seeing half the time. And it's this kind of conundrum. So, yeah, I mean, that's going to go down a whole nother soapbox. But I wanted to get
Well,
to
no,
your
it
yeah,
yeah,
your point
Scott, it,
too.
it relates to my blog post in the title, Firmware Security Realizations. One of the realizations that I had was, here I am carrying around this laptop that I thought was pretty secure. I mean, I never think anything's bulletproof working in this industry, certainly. But I'm like, I've done, a lot to secure my things, my laptop, my computers, my devices. And when I started looking into secure boot, I was like, oh, I didn't have that enabled because I'm an old school Unix Linux person. I was installing the stuff way before there was such a thing as secure boot. When it first came out, Linux distributions were like, for now, just disable that because they hadn't figured out shim and how to play in the ecosystem yet. But they did, and I was like, wait, I missed that somewhere. And shame on me as a security professional going, I'm carrying a laptop that doesn't have secure boot enabled. And that's what spawned this whole two-part series of blog posts that I'm working on. The first went out today. The next one will be published hopefully in the next week or two. That'll talk about Intel ME. Again, that's like, wait, what is that? There's a computer inside my computer, right? Or at least a CPU with a kernel that just runs. And I was like, well, how do I secure that? So I had these same realizations, Scott, that this stuff is important, and I didn't have the right level of visibility in control of these systems, subsystems within my computer, and that was my realization. So exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, you right. The first thing you said there was that you've had this laptop all the time and you kind of trust it, right? But like we do this as entire enterprises, as entire missions in the DoD, or right. We do this all over the place all the time. We emphatically trust the hardware, and when we say the word hardware, we don't mean piece of metal. What we mean is a box full of complex software code, massive sets of code coming from dozens upon dozens of authors, right? From supply chains that come from all over the world that arrive here on this thing that we're calling hardware. And we trust it because we've had to. There's this concept in the DoD world when it comes to cyber that we don't talk about in the commercial world, but it's very appropriate here, which is as like an old Linux admin, let's say back in the 90s or early 2000s, you might describe something as whether or not you have security control over it, meaning you have the authority, the responsibility, and the capability to actually control the security of the code of the device or whatever you're talking about, right? And in when it comes to hardware, though, and you look at like a server room or a data center, who has security control over the hardware? It's not the data center owners, it's the OEMs. And the OEMs only have partial control because they only have partial visibility, connectivity in there full time, right? They don't have that. They only have partial supply chain control. Maybe they can design and manufacture and ship box, but after that box goes through FedEx and everything else, it goes to a warehouse for 5 or 6 months or sometimes 2 years, like they are lately after COVID, right? You talk to somebody from, I won't mention who they are, but they're a very, very large, integrator kind of organization. They were saying they can't believe how full their warehouses are. There's all this equipment that's been there 2, 3, 4 years, and they're basically stockpiling it as like almost like a large capacitor for supply because of the way the world is right now.
Right.
And you have
Yeah,
all this stuff going on, right?
I think it's interesting, Scott, when you talk about the OEMs being just part of your supply chain. What made that evident to me was you talked about in the threat report below the surface for this month the microcode decryptor, and we've talked about microcode as an industry, right? Spectre and Meltdown, I think, shined a spotlight on wait, microcode. Yeah, that's code within your CPU. As an OEM, you're part of that supply chain because guess what? If you want to update Intel controls the supply part of the supply chain for that microcode update. And those were some of the conversations that I was having this week. I'm like, wait, who controls the mic? Like you've got the firmware on, the motherboard or the inside the computer, but now inside the CPU, how does that supply chain work? And
Yeah.
that's a slightly different supply chain where Intel is involved. So if you're Dell, HP, Lenovo, you still have to work with Intel to get the right components, much like Intel ME, to be able to push out those updates to your customers.
Yeah, and I don't think, there's never been a time in the history where the research and the attacker community has been more aware of how that microcode operates and how it works and what those vulnerabilities are, starting with, Spectrum, Meltdown, Rowhammer, all these what you might call hardware vulnerabilities are design decisions a lot of times because of the performance heat kind of constraint aspect, right? You go for prediction technology, etc. And you end up at this thing that is slightly unfixable at the hardware level, and so you try to patch it at the software level to mitigate the fact that you have a hardware problem. But you don't go and throw out all of your hardware just because somebody found a bug called, speculative execution, right? So it's just one of those challenges, and that's one of the reasons why firmware itself, as a broad set, is so interesting, because it is at that nexus where you're asking software to control hardware. You know, it's 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 kind of like, on a device, where does cyberkinetic happen? To use like buzzwords, right? It happens at the firmware level. That's when things actually can go boom. That's when a device can get bricked indefinitely, rather than, oh, the OS got encrypted with ransomware. Fine, restore from backup. Oh, NotPetya rolled through and destroyed, billions of dollars of damage, right? But what did we learn? Oh, it hits the MBR of the master boot record of the hard drives. So now every major operational environment has a stack of hard drives with the OS ready to go, right, as backups. But what if you have NotPetya come again, and instead of hitting the hard drive, it's hitting the UEFI, right? It's hitting another word for BIOS, modern BIOS, and you brick the motherboard, and now you have to rebuild the device from component on up, right, by component. And how many people have a workforce, have the resources or time to
Oh
restore a
yeah.
box
No,
when the
that's
motherboard
easy.
is bricked?
That's easy. We just issue to all users a spy programmer, and then they
Exactly.
can call the help desk and we can walk them. And I joke, for those that we were having this conversation earlier, as you know, the spy flash is what stores a lot of critical components. Your UFI BIOS, right, it being one of them. And it's a chip on the board. You can, through hardware, and I want to explore this on some future episodes. Right, you can clip onto that chip, and through these various spy programmers, read all of the data off of it or reflash it and put it back. So if that becomes corrupt or is wiped out, that's how you would put it back. But it requires a very high degree of skill and specialized hardware and specialized software in order to rebuild that. So the scenario you described, right, all kidding aside,
Yeah.
could be very destructive. When we talk about device destruction, this could be a really bad day for an organization if the destructive nature of the malware starts attacking these various firmware systems.
So Paul, you and I have the propensity, I guess is the right word, to go there when it comes to destructive attacks. I think a
Hmm.
lot of researchers and folks in the field are hesitant or reluctant to actually go down that rabbit hole, because they're afraid that the reaction is, Chicken Little, the sky is falling. You're selling me
Hmm.
FUD, or some of these other responses. And I'll just speak for myself. I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like you and I are able to have this conversation where we can get real for a second, and I feel like it's important to do that. At the risk of sounding like the sky's falling. And the main reason is because, if we're just being honest, and we step back and look at a macro level at the threat landscape itself and where this world has arrived in 2022, post COVID, post all the attacks that went on against hospitals and research facilities and pharma, leading into the Russia-Ukraine war that's been going on since 2014. Some say 2002. It goes as far back as that. And you look at what's going on in that theater, which, by the way, that theater is not just two countries at war using cyberkinetic
Hmm.
tactics. It's expanded to dozens upon dozens of countries, and there was basically a wiper coming out a week at least for the first 3 or 4 or 5 months of this recent conflict.
Hmm.
And those wipers have one objective, one attacker motive at principle, which is to disrupt or destroy operations. And we've talked about these scenarios. Like, I come from the DoD world, doing that for 17 years, supporting the Navy and joint operations and satellites, submarines, etc. And of course, you worry about availability. That's why it's called information assurance, knowing
Hmm.
that you can actually do the thing that allows the mission to take place. But we've always worried about availability and destructive attacks, because those enemies are the ones that would attack a DoD system, right? But now we're in a different world where we're at a cyber war, global cyber conflict, right? yesterday's espionage campaign is easily transferred into today's destructive or disruptive campaign, right?
And I will say, Scott, almost more easily, if I think about the research that I've done on firmware-based systems, a lot of it was focused on how do I get it working? How do I get it to work with some additional functionality? I never like really in not all the time, but in certain circumstances I may have, but I the focus was never how would I destroy that device? Because when it
Yeah.
is, I'm like, oh, well, that's way easier than making it work in a different way. If I just have to destroy it, when I wrote the book on WRT54G routers, I had a small stack, thankfully, of ones that wouldn't operate anymore, and they were bricks, right? That was the easier part was to break it. And now we come into modern conflicts and warfare today. I'm like, oh, that's actually kind of scary. So I totally get we have unique perspectives, I think, on that. But that's what I want the audience to take away is that it's easier to disrupt or destroy a device than it is to persist and make it do things it's not supposed to do while flying under the radar. That's much harder.
Yeah, I used to run red teams, right? You've done a lot of red team yourself, and we used to call that stop points, right? Like you're in an engagement, you know you could do something, but you're not going to do it because it'll disrupt operations. So you make a note of it. It goes in the report, and you say, "I could have, would have, should have done this thing." But if the audience is willing to go along and agree that we have the same threat actors, and I'm just going to call them out, China and Russia, Iran, North Korea, that for many years have been excellent espionage actors, and some of them excellent disruptive or destructive actors too, like APT-28 or Sandworm, right, behind NotPetya, etc. We know that those actors are out there and that they have destructive motives or calls to action, responsibility. But what we don't often realize is that they work very closely with the other sets of actors that are behind long, multi-year, long-running espionage campaigns. And I'm going to bring it back to firmware because whether your motive is espionage or destruction of the worst kind, or the nexus of both, right, that we just talked through, firmware is the quintessentially most important battlefield there is because you can, like I said earlier in this podcast, these campaigns go for multi-year before they're discovered by anyone or any technology, and they can instantly, like APT 29 just has to pick up the phone to APT 28, right? The SVR can call GRU, vice versa, like they did during the DNC hack in 2016, and say, okay, let's shift gears. We've got new orders from headquarters, right? APT 41 is not an easy group to talk about because it's such a large nexus of operators working through state funding as well as like criminal stuff as well as supply chain attacks. Like that's kind of all over the place to say APT 41, but call it kind of the China nexus with PRC behind it, if you will. Oftentimes, if you look at that group as a whole, they're extremely good at supply chain attacks. Like they've proven that time and time again, going back 15 years. They attack update process in firmware, they attack software, they attack antivirus companies to embed in those agents.
Oh, it
They
goes the supply
I
chain
mean
issue goes back even further than that. I think it was
right?
in the 60s where the Russian espionage team managed to plant a listening device inside of typewriters. That was one of the like most
Sick.
fun stories to cover when someone had like dug up that or had been declassified in some way. I forget how it came to fruition, but someone wrote an article. I was like, wow, that's really, really interesting. We think of it today as, well, this is recent developments, but this stuff has been going on for a really long time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the only difference between then and now, other than obvious technology differences, is the scalability of it. It's gone so. Okay, if you look at all the attacks happening, and I like, insert all of them, criminal APT, all of them, right? And you look at the CISA alerts, or you look at the CISA KEVs, those vulnerabilities that are absolutely, in fact, known to be exploited in the wild, right? Leading to direct impacts. And you look at these set of vulnerabilities. Well, in any given year, this whole industry together, all of us comes up with about 20,000 vulnerabilities, right? But CISA's realized through their telemetry and their reporting, working with FBI, everybody else, that only about 4% of that 20,000 vulnerabilities are actually known to be exploited in the wild. So this means a thing that you know that you know. We know that we know these 780 vulnerabilities are exploitable and are being exploited by threat actors as we speak. And if you look at that subset, that 4% of the 20,000, one in four of those are a firmware vulnerability, right? And so, and when you say the word firmware there, we're not just talking about what you and I started talking about. We're talking about UEFI or secure boot process on an x86 server. Like we're also talking about all of those network devices out there that are externally facing. Anybody can reach them across the internet, and they have remote code execution vulnerabilities allowing you to literally grab a shell off that Linux kernel and go into the internal network if you want to, hit Active Directory, deploy malware, grab creds, whatever you want to do, and run a shell back from an internal host back through the device, back to the attacker. And guess what happens? Nothing, because your whole security stack isn't looking for that because you don't have security control over that edge device. You've delegated
And
it
that's
to the
been
OEM.
and that's been pretty common, and I think that, some of the terminology has changed. Back in the day, we used to call those appliances.
Mhm.
And the pitch
Yeah,
for
right.
appliances was me as the administrator, I didn't have to worry about the maintenance and upkeep of it. I applied the updates to it, much like firmware is applied today, where everything's packaged all in one nice package and I can go apply it and my appliance runs the VPN, the firewall, whatever functionality that it's providing. I think today I think of that as enterprise IoT. I think of consumer IoT as very different and having a different almost set of problems, same foundational set of problems, but the setting is different inside the enterprise. And I think we rely on these devices. I think it was Nate that Warfield from our research team that presented at Troopers on some of the F5 vulnerabilities that we've seen a good number of. We've seen a lot of attacks and a lot of vulnerabilities associated with VPN appliances. So there is, again, that kind of shift in terminology is happening there. But this is very much a threat that we should be concerned about. And again, to your point, Scott, like the CIS is calling us out as this is what's being targeted by attackers. So we have to pay attention to this.
Yeah, in fact, one of the you mentioned Nate's talk. One of the really interesting takeaways there is that much like the pulse secure attacks for the I guess it's a CV 2020 11510 attack. That's a remote execution, attack chain of vulnerabilities that was exploited in the wild all over the place by all of the worst actors. And when you looked at it, the bad guys, if you will, figured out how to persist even after you flash that device with known good firmware. And so one of the things Nate was able to do with the F5 example that he spoke to about Troopers, and one of the things he's still working on is the same scenario where, yeah, you exploited the box, you got RCE, you own that Linux kernel, but now what, right? Like, because what if that does get flashed by the victim, if you will, and coming looking at it from that guy's perspective, you don't want to lose that persistence. That's your foothold. That's your way into that organization forevermore for the next 10 years potentially, right? And so to protect that, he's found a way where you can load code that does not get flashed when you do a firmware flash that reinfects the device again. And I don't think I'm speaking prematurely there. I don't know if that's been proven out yet, and there's a video for it, etc. But that's just based on conversations with them, and you're just like,
Yeah, I
"Are
always
you
theorized about
kidding me?"
those. Yeah, I theorized about those attacks when I first started talking about firmware security in our community. I was like, this would be really bad if something like this could happen. And I'm like, it's very beneficial to the attacker to target these style devices because they don't have a user, they don't have a monitor, mouse, or keyboard. And so right there, and often they don't have modern memory protections either, which that's situation dependent and device dependent, but those are all advantages in the attacker's court. And I'm like, attackers are not going to just turn a blind eye to this. This is going to happen, maybe not today. And I'm talking when I was talking about this in 2007 or 8 when I first started speaking publicly about it. And I was like, this could be a bad
Bad
scenario.
day.
And here we are today. And this is a very real thing that we have to deal with.
You really reminded me. Before I was here, I spent about 5 years doing a lot of consulting on the commercial side. FireEye Mandiant and Silence is a consulting arm, etc. We did a ton of incident response, right? And I ran a lot of those operations, if you will. And a lot of times, you would contain the threat and then eradicate the threat, and then you do your hot wash, you update your playbooks, you update your YAR signatures, you build a 90-day plan to get better, and you have a 10x enterprise spend, and you think, okay, I've got my handle. That's not going to happen again. That scenario, and then boom, it pops back up. And I've worked with some of the best there are when it comes to DFAR. I mean, I will say that absolutely with 100% confidence. And yet the actors would spring back up, and it wasn't because another spear phishing email got through. And it was always a mystery because you looked back at all your logs, you did reconstruct, you thought you understood the initial vector in. And it's the initial vector the first time is was rarely the same vector the second time the same actor showed back up, right? And I was always perplexed by this. In a lot of the groups that we dealt with are the ransomware groups, right? Obviously, a hot topic indefinitely. But back then it was like you would see these guys come back up, and you're just like, we thought we got rid of you. What the heck? And now you look at groups like Conti. If you look at the research that our team did based on the leaks of the Conti group, right? I think most people listening, we don't have time to go through that whole story now, but like one of the primary takeaways is one of the operators leaked 60, or actually way more than 60,000 messages that we analyzed at the time, and we found all sorts of references and stuff that we were witness with our own eyes when you translate to Russian and English, where those actors and developers and that whole multi-level organization is very much focused on attacking the UFI and the firmware, whether it's through the permadeal L module, which attacks the UFI because of a device that ships from the supply, right, from supply chain threat, a device that ships with a vulnerability called BIOS write enable. If your BIOS's write enable bit is set to 1, you can write to it. And TrickBot, Conti group, same group of actors working together often in that era, would look at your device once it was on there. And if you were a high value target, what they call an HVT on their top list of targets, and your device was BIOS write enabled, you might get a payload that embeds at the UFI. Okay. Same thing they were doing with Intel ME. You mentioned Intel ME. They were also heavily doing R&D into using the Intel E to be able to, as a vector, to write to the SPY flash. And then again, they have indefinite persistence at that building. And you asked about motive. It wasn't for destruction. You're like, oh, I'm going to brick your device unless you pay me a ransom. That was not the scenario, right? We after we did our research, we ruled that scenario out. It was actually, I want to be able to disable the other security controls on that device, Windows, Credential Guard, etc., and be able to root from the bottom on up and then duck back down to persist indefinitely. So that was very eye opening when we did that research, because you think this might be going on, but when you read it firsthand in their own chat logs, that's when the proof is in the pudding.
Yeah, absolutely. Were there other articles that are in this month's Below the Surface that you wanted to highlight? I know we probably just organically touched on quite a few.
Pay it. We don't need to talk through it, but pay attention to the references on APT 41, China Nexus, because right now in that overall Asia region, there is a lot of cyber conflict going on, right? A lot of espionage, more than there's ever been, probably like 30-fold compared to years past, right? It's always a thing. But why it's so important with firmware is because that group is really adept at infiltrating deep into the OEM of either software or hardware that will make its way to victims, and then those victims will be selectively targeted with a payload. Right? We saw that with Shadowhammer when the ACES update, firmware update would happen, and I think they infected like 1 million devices, but they only targeted a very small fraction of them for what you might call their high value target list, right? Organizations that they wanted to spy on. And this is all coming to a head because you have all the tension going on with Taiwan, right? You have all the tension going on with the Russian-Ukraine conflict, where now the same actor, ironically, China, is spying heavily on Russia, right? Half the targets when you read about are in Russia. China spies on Russia all the time. They're really good at it, right? And so all this comes together and makes you say, what is China's primary leverage, right? With their regional control, with their manufacturing, with Taiwan being so close, with where does firmware come from in the world, right? As a region, and where does China have its deepest hooks into potentially? And so, whether it's espionage or it turns to destruction at any point in the future, firmware is the quintessentially perfect place for China to attack the West, for lack of better words.
Interesting. Well, Scott, thank you very much. And to our audience out there, make sure you check out the July Below the Surface threat report that comes out every month. And I hope Scott and I get a chance every month to do this and have a discussion around the topics. Scott, thanks again.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me. It's so great working with you.